If you wretch open my heart with this crowbar, and leap in, and look around before I've had a chance to organise the place, incinerate the documents, lawyer myself out of recognition, fund an impossibly huge and expensive propaganda campaign designed solely to disseminate lies about who I am and what I am doing on this planet, you will find a field of long grass in a light breeze and thick sunlight. I lounge on the creaking deck of a filthy river vessel, half an hour from Hampton Court, opposite the floating studio of the guy who invented the custard pie in the face gag and the temple of the guy who wrote Hamlet, watching the sunset. I say vessel, singular, but there are actually 3 vessels, or boats, to use the technical term, tethered together and moored with questionable legality to the banks of Hurst Park. This is the first time I have watched the sun set over England without possessing an English address. It looks similar, but carries with it a faint aura of infinite and indestructible beauty. Though this boat is splendidly placed, it is also infested with vermin and lacks a flushing toilet, so I leave the next day and get on a train bound nowhere in particular, and think about what I ought to do with my time, now that I am one step further from the people in these houses and one step closer to the insects in these fields. Till I inadvertently land in Loughborough, where I offer my help to this man who longs to screw soundproof plasterboard to the wall which he is looking at with passionate, meditative intensity. These are some of his tools. He is a DT teacher who also plays in an 80s covers band. His next gig is at Barnsley Football Club. The pencil he is sharpening is for marking out where on the plasterboard the screws should go. We don't have the right size screws, so we drive to the industrial estate and drive back behind a van which says TLC, Total Lawn Care, Free Lawn Analysis. We screw the new screws into the plasterboard and start mucking around with my camera, trying to achieve gimmicky effects which incorporate the visually off-kilter parts of the room we are in and the work we are doing. The next door neighbours are chopping down some beautiful trees in their garden so they can build a climbing frame and give their daughter 6 or 7 years of extremely mild pleasure, verging on indifference, on the days when it happens to be sunny and she happens to be home, while also doing their bit to help make Loughborough an even less attractive place to live. The next day in Loughborough Centre, a man pushing a baby in a pram yells the word faggot in my general direction. I speedily catch a bus out of Loughborough to the adjoining countryside, which, seen from a public bus, reminds me of home. Examining the graphic design on the bus window, I become fascinated and perturbed by these dots. Someone was paid to put these dots here, I think to myself. It mattered enough to someone to pay someone else to put these dots here for them. They seem to make no difference to the landscape except that they put a few dots in the way of it, which feels like a meaningless gesture, but I'm not an expert in these matters. All I feel qualified to say is that there's something joyous about looking out the back of a bus window, as if you are successfully escaping existence and entering the thing next door, without it even noticing. This red elliptical shape cannot see me, neither can this red car. I have so much interest in this man and his allotment that it verges on love. The English countryside is pretty boring most of the time, but there is something about it which is difficult to turn away from, like a boring-looking man or woman who also happens to be naked. I end up in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, which is pleasant and dull. I appreciate things like this woman and this postman on this road, and this woman and this dog in this field, and these workmen in this graveyard, and these workmen on this roof, and this boy sweeping this pavement. I go to check out the castle, but there's paid entry. I once read in a book about Wordsworth, Turner, Constable and Coleridge that before the 18th century, ruins were widely regarded as eyesores, every bit as hideous as car parks or power stations to a modern eye. Their uselessness and uncivilized barbarity, which we admire so much today and which are so lacking from car parks and power stations, were seen by our forebears as justifications for their decimation. I wonder who put up this fence and how they felt doing it. I wonder who chose the font for this property demarcating sign. I sometimes have a terrible feeling that the last remnant of our language to survive the inevitable onslaught of decay homing in on our civilization will be a sign denying someone admittance to something. I would rather it be some banal observation about these flowers being nice, or a remark on the ridiculousness of the English word ladybird. I feel a duty to hang on as tight as I can to everything I love, just in case it happens to be the last thing anyone ever loves. I would love to look at heaven from a garden gate before I step inside, like this. I can stare as intensely at anything this securely footed in its own greenness and purposelessness as I can stare into a pair of green eyes, fixed on me in the simultaneous expectation and fulfillment of something beyond and beneath purpose. Not that I know anyone with green eyes. Green enough, that is, to resemble the view which, I imagine, is captured from the inside of this tower, of the outside of this tower, in its window, from which I imagine horrible screams must have escaped, of putrid, snotty agony at some juncture of its history. Unless it was a storehouse or something, I just sort of assume that everything pre-restoration doubled up as a torture chamber. The tree trunks here are like geriatric elephant hides, or thickly crusted bolts of brown lightning descending in a dancing circle and ascending in flames. Constable once painted the trunk of an elm. I don't know if this is an elm, I only know I love it. Then when I look up, I lose even that. I become so myself, looking up at a tree, that I leave behind the distinction between lover and loved which brings me, addressless and penniless, to its base in the first place. I bathe myself in the blood and water of being no nobody as much as the nobody in my body, which flows from the crucifixion of the man in my brain on the man in my voice, the man who even now is changing into a tree costume and stealing the show from himself, for he is also the play itself, wrapping its words round these branches in the hope, not that it will contain them, but that they will contain it, thicken it, and bellow to the audience, "You may now no longer leave, for you are no longer here." There is enough in a tree to swell one's life like froth over the rim of its glass into a firm, static ecstasy of absolute meaning and meaninglessness, and absolute self and selflessness. There is enough in a tree to satisfy a philosopher asking the question, "What is a tree?" which cannot be said of the philosopher for a philosopher asking what is a philosopher. I'm sure a tree gives a near enough answer to every question, assuming one listens to the question in a treed-in enough setting. Air when it vibrates these leaves, air when it vibrates my voice box, there is definitely something going on here. And though every dictate of taste orders me to stop talking, my tongue strains to run another lap around these vegetable monsters, throwing ideas at them which are so empty they can only be filled with trees, which, I speculate, might be the secret objective of the emptiness of space, or the emptiness of anything. If I'm not careful, I will do nothing else but stare up at trees till I keel over extinguished. I look at this tree stump, and this tree stump. Then walk into what I assume is the town centre, and step into this church, and read the 139th Psalm, which sits open underneath this list of names. Of the names, I am particularly struck by John Meek and Harry Swindle. Though this may sound disrespectful, it amazes me that these men were real. I walk through this sad, placeless bungalow estate and into a field, with sheep and cows and a tree and a bridge and this. Then I go to look at the A42, a formative dual carriageway of my youth, and the first to be opened in Britain after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Peculiar, I feel, that these computational combinations of letters and numbers are capable of inspiring deep affection and nostalgia in me. Perhaps I am part computer. I used to leave school sometimes and stare down at the cars on the M1, imagining that they all had somewhere to be, which I knew perfectly well wasn't true, but which gave me a feeling that this most garish and parasitic of modern conveniences was in fact a thing of cold, rich, tyrannical beauty, which may be true. It's too loud for one to pay attention to the reason that one has stopped to pay attention to it, which makes it a rich symbol for this planet, screaming at the top of its voice that it is screaming at the top of its voice, and that you, personally, are implicated. I pass over and see this church, and this graveyard, and this cottage, and this new build estate. I have never reflected on my love of gates for more than a few seconds, about the time it takes one to walk past a gate and think, well done, gate. My mum hates them. She feels like they exist solely to amputate the planet from the people on it, and though, I grant, they exist to cordon off the world from the world, I always feel as though I have landed on the right side of the world, the one with all I will ever need on it. I've seen enough films to become satisfied with life experienced from the other side of a gate. These buttercups are gorgeous, and so is this old thing. The wind is picking up and the surface of the earth starts to possess this exciting, grandiose wobbliness, not least under these here throbbing jangly boughs, which, by blocking out the light, seem to let even more light in, or on, or through. Sometimes shadows seem so inevitable that it feels as though they predate the opaque objects which cast them, as though they are the fuel which ignites opacity rather than the residual heat which spurts from the sides of it. It is as though someone planted a tree here to match up with the pre-existing shadow and give the negative light a window through which it could pass into the sky, rather than someone planting a tree and a side effect of that tree being the stream of absolute inevitability. Not that the trees themselves don't feel inevitable too. I've always struggled believing that anything got here the way it did, through trailing arbitrary consequences of beyond circumstantial circumstances moving over time like a riverbed. It has always seemed to me as though everything was coming into being the moment I saw it, flurrying about or staying still. That nothing like it had ever arrived before, that nothing like it would ever depart again, but that, nevertheless, it was as bound to be here as all consequences amassed and crammed into the confines of a single, swinging farm gate. This farmer, I note, has alpacas. I admire the geometry of this view of this gate for a few seconds, then admire these trees and look at this little hole of green light, and this pre-ploughed field, and this field in the process of being ploughed. As this tractor approaches me, I wonder what the crop is, how much they get for it, whether this farmer recently voted for Nigel Farage, whether they have seen Alexander Dovzhenko's Earth, whether they have memorized the alphabet of a foreign language, whether they have consciously flattened an animal for fun, whether they have seen Alexander Dovzhenko's earlier work, whether they have heard of Saint Isidore, whether they prefer Gustave Courbet or Jean-Francois Millet, whether they have ever fallen in love with someone whose middle name begins with D and ends with D. I then find a lovely wood which, due to this pesky property demarcating sign, I have to trample up a bit, scrambling through off-track openings to get to the other side, where, after looking at this leaf for a little while, I look at this train track. By lounging near this metal bar and drinking this extraordinarily mediocre soft drink, I qualify myself, by the law of this wobbling steeple, for a transportation ride through valleys of homogeneous English twiddle stickery to the homogeny of housing, shop fronts and shop fronts which constitutes Leicester town centre on a rainy Sunday. A miserable place, even in its least miserable quarter, this rubbish cathedral with a rubbish king in it. As soon as you leave Leicester, everything becomes amazing, which isn't just because Leicester is terrible, it's true of leaving anywhere. Get away from anywhere that's somewhere and you start to feel like a human being again, not a pile of bones propped up by a coarse moulding tissue of identity. You start to feel like a beam of light tearing through a vacuum, becoming it. It's becoming pure light. Even though this land is heavily tended to and I am witnessing it from an artificial tub and filming it through a tiny, tiny screen which I have to keep an eye on, I feel even a filtered, diluted experience is in some sense consummated out here, completed, made important by its unimportance. I feel like the world can tuck its hands into its trouser pockets and whistle the tune it has been carrying around in its crust and waiting to release for years. I feel like my skin can become all pores, that there isn't an object passing by which I wouldn't happily be filled with. In the evening, I returned to an utterly unidentifiable English estate and watched the sunset, first in this window, then over these rooftops. Then, between these traffic lights. Then here.